Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence.
Yep.
Okay, and now we're recording. So maybe can you explain for the audience what you mean by internal family systems and sort of how you understand the theory?
Well, it's been a while since I've actually done the readings on, what the theory was supposed to be. So I'm really operating from kind of how I have, how it's morphed into what I use today. So I want to just put a disclaimer that it's been a while since I've done the actual reading on the theory. So if some things are off, I don't want anyone yelling at me. But the way that I think of it is like, when you think of systems, for us in social work, we like to think in systems. So you have like, let's say an external family system, a general family system. You have like, anyone in this family, and you have the different family members that are relating to each other in a certain way, and that creates tension within the system. It can make things easier in the system. So it's really just taking this idea of any sort of relational system outside in the world and just applying that same view to your own internal world. So like I had said, just kind of looking at how dividing yourself up into parts, recognizing that yourself is separate from your emotions. So, yourself is this beautiful, divine, glowing light of energy that's just full of compassion, full of curiosity. In my eyes, I see it as just goodness, like greatness. And your parts are all there because they sprout up in an effort to preserve the self or to function for the self. So we have like, all of the things like anger and frustration and all the things, some of the things that you were saying, like this envy or jealousy or all these things, it's all operating in a system in our mind. So that's why it's the internal family system, because they're all relating to each other. And I think my therapist introduced me to it by talking about like an interview room at like if a detective is doing like an interview or something. And what was it that she said? It was like, if you could sit down, you can like interview your part. And if you're interviewing your part, like what are the other parts doing who might be on the other side of that one-way mirror, who are looking in? Like what are they saying? What are their thoughts? Because it's not just my relationship to my sadness. It's me asking, hey, sadness, like what's going on? Like, are you okay? Like what can I help you with today? It's then having the anxiety banging on the glass saying, hey, don't ask that question, or the self will not be preserved and things are going to just blow up and that be out of control. So just taking it like some time to look at those relationships and those patterns and how they function for the system, how they prevent things from happening in the system. I think that's why it resonates so much with me, because it really is just like that social work lens of systems just applied to ourselves. So for me as a social worker, it makes total sense. And there's just something really nice about, I've cried when I've meditated and held like the vulnerable part of me that's like, I consider myself a perfectionist for sure, but I know that there's something underneath that. And so I've done a lot of digging to think, okay, like what is this perfectionism part of me who I love and I cherish? Who is she protecting? And when I hold that little piece, it's just this sad little thing that doesn't think it'll ever be good enough. And to just hold that in your hand, in your mental hand, and to say like, I see you, I'm here for you, I'm bringing some of myself energy to you. Oh, the changes I've seen in myself, it's unreal. I want to tell everybody about it.
Yeah. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I just want to back up just a little bit and let you know that I hit record a little late on the video. And so Milena's answering the initial question of what does conversations with the mind mean to her. And we got into internal family systems and those conversations that we can have with the different parts of ourselves. And I love what you brought in about systems because The more I think about almost anything, everything and anything that we can think of is a part of a system. Nothing exists in isolation. As hard as you can think about it, nothing really exists in isolation. So we have, like, even our biological body is not just one thing. It's many different systems working with each other within the body. Our cardiovascular system, our nervous system, our digestive system, and systems within those systems too, all the way down to a cellular system, to a DNA sequence, which is a system, and even smaller, into the quantum field, and blowing it out past ourselves too. Like, plants live within systems, interconnected underneath the soil by microorganisms, and mushrooms and mycelium and all these things. We live within society, which is a system. Our workspaces are systems. Everything is a system. And I think it's a little naive to approach things as if they were in isolation. So I feel like a lot of our scientific research up to this point has been trying to, objectively look at things in isolation, when instead I think maybe they should be looking at the larger systems that come with it. And you talked about internal family systems in relation to external family systems, and that's how I learned about IFS was in external family systems and working with people with addiction. And the way I learned it was that each family member holds a specific role, and there are names for these things. People can go and look these names up, and so there's like the scapegoat and the firefighter and the protector, and all these different roles that people just find themselves in, and they may or may not know that they're playing these roles. But with addiction, the addict is usually the scapegoat. It's usually the person that the family blames for things being sort of off balance in the family. And then when an addict gets better, it disrupts the system. So the addict gets better within themselves. They change their own system. They're feeling great. And I experienced this myself going through recovery. And then you go back to your family or friend systems, and you're literally like a new person. And you no longer play the role of the scapegoat. Like, they can no longer blame you for the things that are going wrong in the family, because you're no longer causing those problems. And so it disrupts the whole system. And now other people within that external system have to adjust themselves and figure out for themselves, like, what new roles do they need to play for the system to come back into a working order. One of my colleagues back in the day at the addiction treatment facility I worked at used to describe it as like when you're baking chocolate chip cookies from scratch, right? Like, you have to add the different components. You got to add the sugar and the butter and the chocolate and the flour and all these things. And if you forget to add one thing into the system, the cookie turns out terribly, so same thing. Like, if someone switches roles out of the scapegoat role, well, now the people who have been scapegoating or trying to protect that individual need to adjust to a different role to fulfill that gap that is now missing, or else the system's not going to work for itself. So same thing internally. Like, if you try and, and part of my older patterns of trying to work with myself was like, I need to eliminate my ego, for instance. And the more I tried to eliminate my ego, the more off balance I was, right? The ego is like an essential component of this cookie that is Shane, And so I have to realize that I can't get rid of the ego, but I need to morph it some way. I need to change it so that it's still there and it still serves its function, but it works for me in a different way. I love you brought up my favorite topic of all time, which is the self.
Yes.
And
Oh.
yeah, and I just took a Metaphysics of the Self course on campus, and it was my favorite course I've ever taken. Had my professor on, I think 2 podcasts ago. And so that's really like the core piece of what this podcast is all about is digging into, what is consciousness, what is the mind, and what is its relation to this larger concept, which is the self. And so I want to hear from you. Like, you started to throw out a few words of how you describe the self, and I want to hear from you, like, how do you conceptualize such a thing? And I realize that none of us really have the answer, but the podcast sort of serves as I like to think of it as like we're all part of this 8.5 billion piece puzzle, and the podcast is the table in which we're all applying our piece of the puzzle to make this bigger picture, and then eventually the self will reveal what it is. And so what is your piece to that self puzzle? What do you think it is?
I love that metaphor for this podcast, first of all. Second of all, I mean, the self is just what I love. I also took a class about the self that rocked my world in undergrad. It was a self-deception course, and it was a combined psychology and philosophy course. And part of the whole course was figuring out what are the theories around the self. And of course, nobody has the answer. And we were reading so many different theories about what the self is. And I don't know, none of them really were resonating with me. But what gave me hope was that this is something that everybody can feel. We know it's there. We can't put words to it. And as perhaps frustrating as that might be, I think that's also beautiful, because it means that there's something that's beyond our ability to see yet as humans. And I like this idea of like this big puzzle of people, because I think the self, I truly think of the self as just divine collective energy. I think of it as, when I visualize it as this like divine white light. And I know I've talked to you about the shame before, but I guess for context, I've had some pretty powerful meditative experiences pretty recently where I've been able to see like this white light almost like radiating from, I almost have this out of body experience, and this is not drug induced. This is just meditation only. And which kind of shocks me, but having this almost out of body experience and like seeing white light. And now ever since that moment, if I'm getting anxious for something, like say I have to do a school presentation, I get super anxious about it. I can close my eyes and envision the space that I'm in, like the classroom, and I can like see white light from myself pouring out into the space, making the space like safer for me, bringing that like comfort, that divine energy, that goodness to the space. And to watch that kind of dissipate my anxiety has been a wild ride. But what I see is ourselves are bubbling up from the same pot of this divine light. And I think that that's why, there are people who think that, we get reincarnated, or there are people that think we have this ability to connect with each other. And I really believe that. I think like, our ability to connect with nature, our ability to connect with other people, I think that all stems from being from the same source, which is just that big, I just picture a cauldron of beautiful, like white, golden, misty light that just bubbles up to the surface in new people all the time. And then when we pass on wherever we go next, the light just sinks back down and then comes up back again. So that's just how I personally envision it. But I love hearing what other people think too, because it's so unique. It's so like special to the person. But
Yeah, I've heard that metaphor before of the, the bubbling cauldron of light. And, the way I've heard it, as far as like related to our individual lifespans, if you can imagine like a big pot of boiling light liquid or something, each little bubble that, bubbles off the surface is a person's life, and it grows in size and it expands in its knowledge and its understanding. And then all of a sudden the bubble pops, and that's the end of life, maybe an end of a lifetime. But then it doesn't just like disappear, but it returns back into the cauldron to feed further bubbles that are popping up. So I love that metaphor. I'm curious though, when you were studying the self, what were you studying? Mostly Western philosophies of the self? Because in my class we studied some Western philosophies of the self, but most of it was rooted in ancient Indian and ancient Buddhist philosophies of the self. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think the focus of our class was less really on theories of the self. That was kind of like the introduction, and it did focus on a lot of Western ideas because I
Mm,
think they were doing that because moving into like the academia around self-deception, of course, it's like all old white men that are
mm,
writing
mhm.
papers around uh, theories of self-deception. So it was very Western focused. And it was, yeah, it was a lot of white men. The class was mostly white men. So it's a very like narrow view. And it's interesting because I have a book called Perspectives on Self-Deception. And I'm like, these are all perspectives coming from the same like type of person. So I mean, it's something I'm interested to go beyond. And I think that I took a class in world religions, and I think I got more of a sense of the self in other cultures through that class than I did in the self-deception class.
Mm.
Sorry, Dr. Wood, if you're hearing this.
Yeah, you also mentioned this inner light piece, this part of yourself that you can tap into to calm your anxiety, when you're about to
Mm,
give presentations. And what's interesting is that some recent studies, I think in the last 10 years or so, have we've developed these really sensitive technological camera equipment, and we're finding that the human body itself emits its own light source. That deep within our cellular makeup, we are a light source, and it's not coming from outside of ourselves. I think the experiment, they had someone sit in like a Faraday cage that was completely blacked out, like no sources of light, and then shown a camera on them, and there was light emanating from this person, right? And
oh,
so
so what is that?
yeah,
What
I
is
know.
that?
It sort of validates all the ancient traditions who talk about like this inner light, and it really gives some scientific evidence to those claims. Another
Yeah.
thing you brought up that I thought was really cool was the collective self.
Mm,
That we're all part of this big giant pot, right? And I think most people, at least here in the West, think of themselves as an individual self. And for sure, I think that is a part of who we are, and that serves its purpose for us, especially when we're pursuing, life goals and families and things like that. But there's this other deeper piece, this piece that we're all connected to, which again is a system. This collective system of selves. It's almost like some giant net, and in each node of the net is an individual self, but all these individual selves make up this giant fabric
mhm.
um, of the universe and of collective energy. So I love to think of it again, going back to the systems approach.
Yeah, you know what I'm just thinking too? We both were kind of talking about this idea of a bubbling cauldron of light that is the collective energy that is all of us. And I'm thinking like to bring that even further, the presence of bubbling implies like reaction. It
Mm,
implies like cooking. It implies like something is being there's some sort of chemical reaction, something happening with this bubbling. And like the thought of that and what is being cultivated, what is being created through these lifetimes of this self light getting to roam the world and getting to have all these new experiences, like are those brought back into the self? Like what is being created from all of our individual experiences retreating back into that big cauldron of light? And that's just like
mm. Yeah, and I think of like, just like if you're boiling water that has like, I don't know, mixture, just for the case of this like thought experiment, like you're boiling water with like some spices in it or something, or some salt. You throw salt in there, right?
Mhm.
And so this boiling water is boiling, and it's turning the salt over, and there's chemical reactions. But if you boil it long enough, the bubbles that are created don't just return to the water,
Mhm.
but there are other reactions going on. So you boil it long enough, and there's an output from the boiling water, right? Like it turns into steam, and it leaves the cauldron out into the greater space around it, right? And you keep boiling that water down, and it gets more and more concentrated. It gets more and more salty. It gets more and more, you know, pure, I guess, something like that. And so I'm trying to apply that same idea that we see out in our everyday world to like this giant cauldron of self energy, that if it keeps boiling and bubbling like that, like with each bubble that pops, there is some amount of that energy that is released into the space around it. Who knows what that is? Maybe that's soul energy, maybe that's something that's just going out. But as this system continues over billions and billions of years, eventually, perhaps, maybe it will boil itself down into like a super concentrated self, like some higher evolved entity, or a higher sense of knowing, or something that is even more pure than it was when it was diluted out into the liquid that was in this cauldron.
Yep, that's what I'm saying. Like, what is it? What is it going to be? I don't know. But I think that just gives me like hope. You know, I think in a time like, I guess all of humanity, where things have been very chaotic, and you know, you never know. You're always, you know, concerned about the future. I think that's one thing that I can find hope in, is that there's something like that that's bigger that's happening. And I almost am like, you know, the whole Big Bang Theory and all that big energy that started, and as it cooled down, that's what was able to create this kind of new life. I think the same thing applies for this theory of the self. Like, what is, when we cool down, like what is going to be created from that? And I don't know, gets me excited.
Yeah, and even just using those terms you just threw out, like, think about your everyday life and how, I mean, you and I are both in school, right? So we're constantly stressed, and we're burning calories in our brain at such high levels. You know, we're creating all this heat, and there's so many people out there in the world, especially right now with all the turmoil and COVID and all these things, that we're so agitated, and we're so hot, and we're vibrating at this high level, that if we, like you said, like when we can cool ourselves down, when we can slow things down, um, then I think, you know, we can increase our ability to like manifest great things in the world, right? It seems like when we're all bubbling and agitated, there's less, I mean, there's still creation going on, but it's not the same as when you slow things down, and let them just settle.
Yeah, and not to let my inner meathead out too much, but I also like to think about it as a workout. Like, same thing. You're putting in all of that energy, the body's getting hot, things are tearing in your body. And it's not until the cool down that your muscle is actually repairing and building up something new. So I think it's applicable throughout the spectrum of everything.
Yeah. So maybe that, I mean, that gives me a lot of hope that once, you know, once civil unrest and COVID and all these things start to cool down, and people start to settle and become calmer, that will be a period of regrowth. Like you said, just like muscles need to cool down and stop working so hard before they can start growing. I think that's good advice for all of us, to slow ourselves down and use meditation and use breathing and go for a walk and spend time with family and with your dogs and with things like that. Just slow yourself down, because those are the periods of growth. It's not when you're pushing so hard and you're agitated.
Yeah, and it's just messed up that I think that we live in our society here in the United States, in this world, this pressure cooker, that, you know, we're expected to maintain this level of work that is just unrealistic. And I was actually I read this social justice blog. I'll have to find the name of it, but the author was talking about um, what was it? I'm sorry, I'm like totally blanking on it right now. It was, oh yes, it was about how rest is like an act of protest. And she was saying that, like, you know, I think it was, oh, it's called the nap ministry, the nap ministry. And it's yeah, she was talking about how like napping and taking rest and slowing down is an act of protest in and of itself to a society that's trying to make us work to the point of it not being healthy. And I just love that idea. I think that's because it's so opposite of what, especially you and I being in academia right now, that whole environment is about pushing yourself all the time to your limit. At least that's my experience so far. And so it's just nice to think of like, okay, maybe even work around activism doesn't have to be this angry, heated, hot thing all of the time. And that's a good reminder for me, since that's how I tend to approach things, that sometimes the cool, calm periods are actually where the change happens. So I just had an epiphany today. So thank you, Shane.
Yeah, and me too. I'm all about pushing against the status quo. I think that's part of my reason for being on this planet, and definitely a reason why, certain people I've come across, tend to think I'm either intimidating or want to disassociate from me because I push, and I like to challenge the way people think, because if we get stuck in and locked in our own ideas, then even me too, I try and challenge myself on a daily basis. So that just gave me an idea that, come next fall, once I start teaching courses in the social work department, I think I'm going to incorporate a weekly assignment where people have to force themselves to take a nap.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
And see what happens, and maybe take a nap and write a reflection paper on how that affects your work that you do.
Yeah. Oh, I wish I had people assign me naps.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
So you're working on a dual master's degree right now in social work and public health, with concentration in global health and health disparities. And I definitely want to get to the drug policy stuff, which I'm sure we can talk a lot about. But first, with your background right now in what you're studying, and yeah, like everyone knows, there's a global pandemic going on right now. So definitely most people's minds are on human health and human health disparities, and how COVID may be showing up differently in different populations, impoverished populations, populations where, families are living with 10 plus people in a home versus, smaller nuclear families. So I'm just curious about, with all the stuff you're learning about, and what intersections you're coming to with COVID, and how you're starting to like understand this thing that is going on right now.
this is my daily struggle. I think, starting to work in public health, I came from the harm reduction world. So I was really excited. I was like, this is great. Public health, like, let's help people, let's change the world. COVID has really changed. I think it's changed my outlook on public health. And I think it's really highlighted some deep seated issues in our society here in the US. And what I boil that down to, sorry, I know we're just talking about boiling, but I actually meant like what I boil that down to um, is erosion of empathy. I was reading a paper on basically, okay, so our individualistic society, I believe, has led to a reduction in community and an erosion of empathy that we are seeing now with COVID. And my reason for getting to that conclusion is I was reading an article about people's views toward immigration in the United States. And they were saying that, people with oppressed and marginalized identities were far more likely to display empathy towards, the people in cages that are in cages right now at the border. And like, the white privileged people were more likely to just not feel empathy towards that. And they were talking about how in our society, like, community is kind of eroding and empathy is kind of eroding. So that to me is like one of a huge barrier to public health, because public health is all about the population and getting the population to all have equal access to health. Yeah, and I can see it when I frame it that way. I can see it, and I think that the greatest challenge of public health, it's not just about our messaging or our policies or anything, like any of the nitty gritty that we think public health is. It's how can we bring humanity back into health? How can we bring the empathy and compassion that we have as public health professionals? How can we translate that? Because yeah, we have the knowledge about epidemiology and we know statistics and we know science, but if we're living in a world where a lot of people aren't listening to that, how can we bring ourselves to that human level to connect there first. And that's my big struggle right now. I do not have an answer.
Yeah, and you know, across time, you know, we as humans, we always find something um, to distinguish ourselves from others. You know, to separate ourselves from others, whether it's gender or race or religion or something. We always seem to find something that says I'm in the right way and you are doing things differently, so you're different, and it's led to genocides and, like you said, like erosion of community, erosion of empathy for other. I think for me anyway, one of my passions is bringing people together who see themselves as different, right? And one of the big questions that I've asked a number of guests on the show is like, if there's so much disparity, so much focus on what makes us different in this world, like what is something that can bring us all together under the same umbrella to have that compassion and empathy for each other, understanding that we are all the same, right? And for me, I think that going back to the self, I think that that is the one thing that we all share, you know, whether you're disadvantaged or disabled or, you know, a different race or a different, you know, gender or whatever, different religion. We all have, and we're all connected to that larger self. And I think that if we can promote that piece and advertise it or throw it out there and teach people that, you know, at all of our core, we are all the same thing, regardless of how we look and what we believe. Um, we need something to unite us all underneath one umbrella of humanity in order to feel that empathy. And you bring up a number of different things that I want to just touch on real quick and then have you jump back in. But you talked about harm reduction, something that I'm seeing with COVID and the way it's put out in the media. There is hardly any talk about harm reduction with COVID. I mean, masks, yes, but you know, some science is showing that the masks don't even help that much. But more importantly, like there are some real harm reduction things that people can do, like proper diet, proper exercise, getting out in the sun, getting out in nature. All these things help boost our immune systems and can be used as harm reduction approaches against something like this virus. It seems like the media's message these days is more about testing and identification of people who have it, and containment and quarantine, and like um, all these,
Buzzwords.
yeah, all these strategies that are like keeping people separate from each other, you know. And I hate to bring in this example, but it reminds me of you know, the Third Reich and Hitler and stuff, and how he would separate people based off of classification systems instead of um, you know, bringing people together. And you also mentioned community, and you know, there are tons of studies showing that being social and being a part of community and interacting with people helps improve our immune systems, right? So I I still train my jujitsu, and I go to the jujitsu gym multiple times a week, and I'm rolling around in other people's sweat, and we're sharing each other's microbiomes with multiple people. And part of me feels like by doing that, it's like a little baby rolling around in the dirt. Like it's strengthening my immunity by exposing myself to other people's microbiomes. So it's like a harm reduction strategy for me. Whereas the narrative out in popular culture right now is like, stay inside your house, like don't interact with anybody, nobody except for your immediate family. And what that's doing is it's decreasing our immune system's ability to fight off things that come in, because we're not interacting in community. I just know that the social impact of, you know, interacting with my neighbor across the street makes me feel good. You know, it makes my system feel good. And we're not doing that anymore. I go to the grocery store now and people won't smile anymore. They'll just give you this weird look and like, stay away, stay 6 feet away, you know. Um, that is certainly not helping us as a species and not helping with our immunity. And the fact that we use the term, and I hate this term, I think they did it on purpose, but the term social distancing, right? The literal, interpretation of social distancing means don't talk to people, don't socialize, don't be in community with people. When instead, maybe they should have used a term like physical distancing, which would have been a lot more accurate to what they're trying to portray. Instead, they use social distancing. And I think it's partly, a manipulation tactic that they're trying to use to separate us even more, so that we don't band together and we don't have this sense of community. And I don't know. I think it's damaging to all of our systems.
I think those are good points. And I appreciate this conversation already because these are different thoughts than what I have. And I need more of that because I am in such an echo chamber of other public health people. And I am one of those people that has been saying, like, stay home, don't go anywhere, because I'm so intimately associated with the graphs and the modeling and seeing transmission. And it's just, that's what I'm seeing all day, that I have a sense of urgency where I'm like, we need to slow this down, we need to stop this. That, sometimes that's my only focus and I don't really go beyond that. And it's interesting because I've had conversations with some other harm reductionists because I've been seeing this argument a lot of like, we can't tell people don't go places or don't travel or don't do anything like that. And we should take a harm reduction approach by saying like, here's what you can do if you choose to travel home or if you choose to do this. And I've been struggling with that because I think a lot of the communities that I've worked with and have been a part of, like those are the people who need to be protected from COVID. So telling the general population who, has the luxury of being able to stay home to take certain precautions if they're going to go out, I don't know if that's a legitimate harm reduction approach, if knowing that people who have the ability to stay home, they don't have to go out for an essential job, they don't have, an essential reason to leave the house. If they have that privilege, then I would argue that it's not harm reduction to try to tell those people to do, to take extra precautions if they're going to do something, because that action in and of itself will cause harm to Black people, to Indigenous people, to Latinx people. And we know that. So I'm like, I've been struggling so hard with these. I've been seeing a lot of like news articles coming out like, we need a harm reduction approach. Abstinence only doesn't work. And I'm like, okay, but there's one thing to talk about that with drug use, where it's a personal choice and you have your rights over your autonomy. But when you have a virus that is so easily transmittable, it's hard for me to wrap my head around this idea that we should be telling people to reduce harm in a certain way. And I just think that's part of my bias coming out as a public health person and as someone who's seeing the data all the time. And I agree with you in that the social isolation it's damaging. It's hurting us for sure. And I think that's also exposing, like I said, these cracks in our society around community and around individuality. And I think about, I don't know, I just.
Well, what do you think about in the case of like, well, you're talking about like community harm reduction, which I think is has so many moving pieces, and it's such a big problem to try and tackle because there's so many variables in there. But what do you think about the idea of like promoting out in the narrative like an individual harm reduction? So people should take it upon themselves to be more responsible about their own health and take steps to reduce harm to themselves, and by doing that they're going to reduce harm to others. I keep going back to this example of like infants, like when they're babies and they're developing their immune response to the world, we can see very clearly in studies that the kids who are kept in dust-free environments in the home, like they have a greater chance of developing autoimmune diseases and negative responses to the world out there, right? Whereas I was raised in an environment that was dusty, and my mom would let me go play in the dirt and things like that. And those kids tend to have much stronger immune systems because their systems are exposed to these things. So that's sort of my theory around jujitsu, and exposing myself to other healthy individuals. Like we still like we have a rule in the gym, like if you're sick at all, like don't come in. And and we do the temperature checks and all that stuff too. But if you're still interacting with healthy individuals, I think you are strengthening your immune system. And we also know, at least we don't know much about COVID so far, but one thing we do know is that people who have comorbidity with other health issues, those people tend to suffer a lot worse and have higher rates of contraction. And so if we can help promote as a harm reduction strategy, like, hey, work on yourself so that you don't have comorbidities with other things if possible, like obesity. Like if you're overweight, like work on that in the lockdown. If you if you smoke, stop smoking. If you drink a lot of alcohol, cut that down. Try and reduce your comorbidities as a personal responsibility for your own harm reduction. And then when you go out in the community, your immune system, your health will be at a place where you're less likely to contract it. And also being less likely to contract it, you'll be less likely to give it to other people.
I think so. I work in a research lab right now that does type 2 diabetes prevention in teens. And the whole focus of our lab is obesity in adolescents. And I think what you're saying is interesting. And I would say yes. I mean, we should be promoting like this type of harm reduction on that individual level. And what I've seen from working with people or with teens who have family histories of obesity is that there are so many things beyond the individual control of a person that contribute to those things. So I think we can promote this like individual behavior change, but it has to be paired with something else. Like for a lot of people, depression, we know that depression in teenagers who have a history of type 2 diabetes can increase their chances of getting type 2 diabetes. And so, it's one thing to say like, get some more physical activity, try to make healthier choices with the foods that you have at home, or go out and get different foods. But when it comes to like depression and teenagers, our mental health care system in this country is, again, these things are just getting amplified. Like we don't have access for people. Same things with food. We have like food deserts. We have unsafe neighborhoods. A lot of the teens that I work with, part of our program the intervention that we do with teens is me, a white person, saying, hey, like try to go outside and get this much physical activity. And them being from this lower income area saying, I'm not going for a walk outside. This neighborhood is not safe. I cannot do that. So I think we need to just get a little more creative with our messaging and try to work with people to problem solve on some of those barriers, while at the same time, we have to have a hand in policy change. Because trying to tell people to change and do something different, we've been doing that over and over again, and it just doesn't really work. It doesn't really work when the systems that exist are not conducive to that change. So that's what I'm most passionate about, is like, how can we show support for the people who want to make individual behavior change or who need to make individual behavior change, while at the same time holding our people in power and systems accountable for creating the conditions that lead to these health disparities.
Yeah, and I'm recognizing my own privilege in some of the things that I've said so far too. Like, not everyone has the ability to to do things for themselves to reduce their comorbidities. There are a lot of genetic things that you can't really influence yet. Maybe with the future of CRISPR, we can do some of those things, which is also scary in some ways. But
yeah,
I'm definitely, hearing you say that, I'm recognizing my own privilege, recognizing that, I have the means and the capability to eat better and to exercise and to go for a walk in my neighborhood, which is, quite harmonious. And, I have nice neighbors, and I live in a beautiful state of Colorado with lots of sunshine and less pollution than some other areas. Definitely recognizing that now. And, I appreciate you bringing that out of me, because that's been one of my major growth areas that I've been trying to push myself in the field of social work is like recognizing exactly how my white privilege affords me a lot of things that I don't necessarily recognize. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I had to come to that realization too. I mean, when I was first starting out in psychology, and that's why I switched from psychology to social work, because psychology is very much how can we change you and your pathology and make you fit into society better? Or, part of it is about reducing suffering, but it's also about labeling and pathologizing certain things. So that's why I love social work, because it's like, let's look at everything around you. Like maybe you're not the problem. Maybe it's everyone around you. And this is going to sound a little radical, warning, but we've been talking a lot in social work, self-care. Self-care is like the number one thing that we talk about. You have to take care of yourself. You have to reduce your stress. You have to reduce X, Y, and Z. And part of me, and I'm in a book club where we were discussing this a little bit, is wondering if this concept of self-care is promoted so heavily to prevent people from reaching a point of stress or pain that catalyzes action to fight against a system. Because I just think about like if people are feeling depressed because they're poor and we're telling them, oh, well, take a bath or, use these coping skills. Like in a way, I can see how the practitioners on the ground would say, okay, well, that's reducing this person's suffering in the moment, and that's important.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm holding that in one hand. And on the other hand, I'm like, but the conspiracy theorist in me is like, what if this is a way to prevent people from their frustration and anger reaching a point of like revolution?
Yeah, totally. Like, yeah, I can totally see that too. Like, coping mechanisms and meditation and all those things are great for immediate relief. But like if change is going to happen at a larger systems level, or if we're going to be motivated enough to make change or to stand up or advocate, like we have to reach a level of critical mass where we're just like so pissed off or so depressed or so angry with the way things are that motivates us into action to change things. Whereas like if we're constantly like every day, like I use this metaphor with my clients, like we all have this bucket, and if the bucket fills up with anger, it's just going to spill over into an outburst. So every day do things to empty the bucket a little bit, empty the bucket. Well, for some pieces of change, like we need that bucket to fill up so that, everybody's bucket just spills over all at once. And then we all hit the streets and start making change, So you're right. I think, it's like a double-edged sword. Like it helps us in the moment, but it also probably prolongs some of these problems and some of these issues with that daily draining of your stress.
Yeah, and totally ties back to what we were talking about earlier. Like in every instance, we were talking about how the cool down period is when like the actual real change happens.
Mhm.
But before the cool down period, there has to be the big bang. There has
An
to be the
explosion.
boiling cauldron. There has to be the heavy workout. So, and I think, yeah, we're at this I think where we're at right now, just from my perspective, it's like that point just before boiling.
Yeah.
And to stay at that temperature for a long time, it's like traumatic. You're never getting the release. You're never getting the I think about it like psychedelics too, that they say the key is when you have a really powerful, even if it sometimes feels subjectively negative in the moment, the key is to integrate what you've had in your psychedelic experience into your life after. So if we can't do that, we're just kind of stuck in this like bad trip of life. That's just, we're never going to get the chance to integrate the lessons that we're learning if we don't have that explosion followed by the cool down where we can kind of integrate what we're going through now into our life and make changes. So
Yeah, I agree with you. And the way it feels to me is, you said it so well that I think we are, our societal bucket is full to the brim, and the few things that are happening right now are just draining a little bit off, but it's, it's staying at that full level where it's just at the tipping point, but not quite enough to knock it over. And that, I mean, you carry a bucket it's that full and it's really heavy. You can't carry it for very long before you start getting, all sorts of issues. So yeah, I hope that we can find a way to tip that bucket over, but in a way that is not completely going to destroy, our society. And the way that it's, when you look back on history, we've reached this tipping point a number of times, and huge empires have grown and then completely come smashed down and been burned to the ground. And that's what I hope doesn't happen to our culture. I see it as a possibility, but I think that if we can take the lessons from the past and try and avoid some of those major crashes, like we're gonna need. So I say this to my clients again too. Sometimes before you get better, it has to get worse, and I think that's what has to happen to society too. Like, in order for us to reach that cool down period, for it to get better, we have to accept that it has to get a little bit worse. And my hope is that it doesn't get so bad that it that we just destroy everything in that explosion, but that it's just enough that we can tip that bucket over and maybe filter the water in a way that is gonna go help everyone.
Yeah, it's hard to think about because part of me, the more I learn, like the more I guess pessimistic I get. Like I'm an optimist by nature. Like I believe in the best. Like I want to believe that like people are good, that the world can get better. And I think being in an academic world where I'm forced to just look at social work policy and history of policies and our systems and capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, I just get to this point where I'm like, none of this is working. We need to throw it all out the window. And then in that, I'm like, okay, but what happens after that? Like we don't, but then that's also opportunity. So part of me is scared because we don't know what will happen. Another part of me says that complete collapse of our oppressive, classist, racist structure could actually be that boiling over explosion point that we do need. It's just really scary to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, the unknown is always seems to be a source of fear for people. For me too. And I think that's a big source of fear for a lot of people with COVID and social unrest too, is like, yeah, the systems that we live in are scary and oppressive and harmful, but it's also scary to think of like what could come next because we don't know. And right now, like one of the things I've been harping on is that, and this came out mostly out of me during the Black Lives Matter movement and when people were out protesting. And, I'm all for it. I'm all for social change and advocacy. But there was no real apparent leadership. There were a lot of different groups, vying for a lot of different things, and no particular leader stepping out like a Martin Luther King Jr. type figure to try and unite people and lead and be that figurehead. And I think a lot of it has to do with fear. A lot of people want change, but they don't know exactly what they want. And we need some serious leadership, someone with a vision that that can hear everyone's voices and come up with a plan so that there's less fear. There's less fear if we have a plan for what's next, as opposed to just saying we need change, because that's great. We do need change, but we need change into what?
Yeah, I mean, if I was a Black person in America right now, I would not want to take a leadership position in the
Sure.
Black Lives Matter movement at all.
Yeah.
Because I think we've seen what happens to Black leaders
Yeah.
who rise up. The Black Panthers, we look at Malcolm X, we look at Martin Luther King even, like, and for some, like, yeah, how do you take a leadership role in something that is so important, in something that requires somebody with lived experience to take on that leadership role, in a world where historically our government has suppressed and even like killed people who have taken these leadership roles? So it's like, what do you do in this culture of fear that we're living in now? How do you form leadership? How do you form groups when there's so much in our system that is trying to prevent anything from the Black Panthers ever happening again? They have the money, they have militarized weapons, they have the power is on this one side. So it's very understandable to me why there's no leadership. And at the same time, I agree that you need to have leadership there. So I think that's what I try to think about, what my role is going to be in this. because I'm earning advanced degrees, and now I'm having the realization that, should I even have these advanced degrees? Like, is it fair that I rode my little privilege magic carpet
Mhm.
into these degrees when people with lived experience should be having leadership positions? And how can I use my position, whatever it ends up being, to really like work myself out of a job essentially and like get people into those leadership positions? But what I've seen happen is that these systems co-opt things that have been the result of the people on the ground. I see that a lot with drug use. People who inject drugs have been doing syringe access programs forever. There's always been people who have been handing out sterile supplies, handing out clean syringes. Like, it's happened, from that community. And then it gets, when people are seeing, oh, that kind of works, now they're taking that position away from other people and paying people like me who like rode their privileged magic carpet into that position. So
Mm.
it's like, how do we, and then that whole movement they're still marginalized. So we're saying, we're going to take your method that you came up with and that you have been doing successfully. We're going to make it ours now. We're going to limit what you can do. And you have to kind of work with us in order to access those same services. And we see that happen with a lot of different movements. And I don't know, I just worry about that happening with social work, or like with what I want to do. Like, how do I get people into leadership positions that don't cause them harm by having to conform to an inherently oppressive system?
Mhm. Yeah, and you certainly couldn't have like a white person leading the Black Lives Matter movement, right?
Yeah.
Like they would be probably less likely to be assassinated or something, but it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense. You have to have someone, like you said, with that lived experience be in that position. Um, so shifting gears just a little bit, and I know this is a really important topic, but you've touched on it a couple times, and this kind of bleeds into um, the idea of drug policy and drug policy reform, and your work with syringe access programs. Um, so right now, I'm part of the Denver psilocybin panel, um, and so since we decriminalized psilocybin, we put together this panel of 10 of us, and including, myself. I'm the mental health representative for the state. But we have like the Denver district attorney and the chief of the sheriff's department and police and city council members and things like that on the panel. And um, right now we're just collecting data on what the decrim um, what effects the decriminalization had on the city. And so far the results are great. There's been very few arrests, and all the law enforcement agencies are saying, like, yeah, we don't really come in contact with anybody. This is not really a problem for us. um, so that's going to eventually lead to policy reform and hopefully policy suggestions on our part for legalization. We're working on a legalization measure for the next ballot. Yeah, we're excited. But one of the things that we brought up in our panel as a possible avenue that we might want to pursue are safe use sites. And this is really related to your syringe access program. So in one of the recent election cycles in Denver, syringe access points or safe syringe sites that was shot down, or it was
Yes, it
not really
was.
good. Very disappointed in that, because I mean the research is clear on it that safe syringe sites, they reduce the spread of certain disease. They give people, clean access. People who are going to use drugs, regardless, they give them a safer way to do it, so that they're less likely to do damage to themselves and spread it to other people. But it got shot down because I think a lot of the stigma is still there, and a lot of that research is not being translated properly to the general public who's doing the voting. And so we're trying to push for safe use sites for psychedelics in Denver and then the larger Colorado area. And I think this would be a great idea, because right now, people, like I said, people are going to use drugs whether we like it or not. We have always used drugs as human beings. Some people even theorize that we became human beings because of drugs and because of our interaction with certain psychedelics that helped maybe expand our prefrontal lobes and create greater connectivity in our brains. But having safe use sites would, I think, if people can get past the idea that it is a way to promote drug use and just see that, by having safe places for these people to go to use their psychedelics, that these safe use sites would have trained medical professionals, trained mental health professionals, um, the ability to link people up with resources in their communities for addiction treatments and things like that, like directly, right? Like you don't have to go out and seek these people out. They're already in the facility using. That it is actually going to probably reduce a lot of harm that people are scared of. It's going to help take people off the streets that are using on the street, and bring them into a safe environment where, they won't even come in contact with them as much because they're in this safe environment. So I want to hear a little bit about your work with the syringe access program and the successes and some of the challenges that you had, and then what you think about Denver shooting down the syringe access program, and then also our ideas for bringing in safe use sites for psychedelics.
Oh, where to begin? First, what I'll say is that, this argument of, in the harm reduction world, we call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And this idea of people, I don't want people using drugs in my backyard. And to me, I'm like, okay, but they're already using drugs in your local McDonald's bathroom. They're already using drugs in your library. So what's the difference between having this building? So that's just one thing I'll say. What I'll say is what I learned the most about working at the syringe access program is that injecting heroin on a daily basis that you don't know whether it's laced with fentanyl or not is not a fun way to live. Like people that I worked with, they were not having a good time. Like this was not drug use for recreation purposes anymore. It was to normalize the body. It was to get back to that state of functioning that they now needed heroin or another opiate to use. But this idea that it's going to increase drug use, to me, I'm just like, what's the evidence for that? Like we have evidence from other countries that says that drug use did not increase, but for some reason in our country we do not, we're like, well, that's that country, there are all these factors. But riddle me this: school resource officers, aka police in schools in the United States, they're the reference that they use to say that school resource officers are effective in the US. They have one report that cites one research article from Canada, from a small portion of Canada, that showed resource officers to be a good thing for schools, when the rest of the research in the United States says that they're not a good thing. So for me to have one area, law enforcement, pulling research from another country and saying, this is why we should do this, and then saying, no, we cannot do this because this is another country, to me, I'm like, we need to get better. Yeah, we need to get better with how we're translating science and all that. And I think the other argument for supervised consumption sites, for safe use sites, is this: we come back to it all the time, it's human connection. When I worked at the syringe access program, people were living in shame. They were living in shame. They didn't want to be seen. They were hiding from people. I remember I had a gentleman come in who, I was always just hanging out there. I'm making Narcan kits. If you come in, I'll do your thing, and that's it. I like to think I'm a pretty easy person to talk to, but he's told me that I was the first person that looked him in the eye and smiled at him in like a year. And when he said that, I was like shocked by that, because think about that. Like, think about not having someone look you in the eye for a year. The thought of that is like, I don't know, it's a lot. So from that day on, like, we had a little coffee machine in there, but he would come by all the time. He would drink coffee with us and we would just chat. He wasn't even there for supplies sometimes. He'd be like, oh, I'm all set on this, but if it's okay, I'd like to just hang out. And I'm like, absolutely. Like, of course you can come hang out here. And that relationship building, I wasn't technically a therapist for him. I was a harm reduction counselor in terms of like, providing tips on safer use and things like that. But he opened up to me so much, and I was able to see like his real personality coming out by the end of like my time at that location. And we were able to end up linking him with some like mental health services and things like that. But I think the opportunity for people who use drugs to know that they're walking into a place where people aren't going to judge them and are going to be willing to talk to them like people even just that alone would be my argument for a supervised consumption site. Aside from everything else, we know that it reduces overdose deaths. We know that it reduces disease transmission. But to build human connection is the pro that I think we should focus on more than anything else. It's like that, like you said, linking people to resources, linking people to, if they want to get help, they can get help. If they don't, they don't. That's fine. And to have non-judgmental people in a spot like that is the best. That's the thing though, is that you'd have to make sure that you're getting the right people into these spaces so as to make it actually have the function that it was intended to have. But I'm really disappointed that Denver shot it down, and I think it's just a little too radical for people right now. And it's hard because if more people saw the reality of what it's like to inject drugs, they wouldn't feel the same way as they do now. Because people would come in, they're scared. I've had people crying to me saying that they feel like they need to use because they're having withdrawal symptoms, but they don't know if they're going to die the next time that they use. And that, to me, it's like, for anyone to say that it's a moral failure and people are choosing to do this for fun, it's like, I have evidence that's to the contrary. But I like the idea of safe use, like psychedelic sites. I haven't really like dug too much into that. I've been focused more on like the overdose epidemic type of thing. But I think that's a great idea. I just think, like, I wish we could get to a point where we could expand it to like all drug use, because I look at who uses psychedelics compared to who uses meth or like cocaine, or not cocaine, like crack or any of these things. And there is kind of a qualitative difference to the type of people that have been able to use psychedelics and the level that is, the stigma is being reduced compared to other things.
Yeah, for
I don't know if
sure.
that makes sense, but
And that's something in the psychedelic realms that's being talked about a lot, is it's called psychedelic exceptionalism, where yeah, it's mostly, white, middle-aged, middle class people who are engaging in psychedelic use. I do have quite a few friends in my network who are out on the East Coast who are Black and African American, who they they call what they do urban shamanism, and so they live in projects of Boston and New York and Detroit, and they engage in psychedelic medicines, and they're trying to bring psychedelic medicines to their people within those settings. But they're using a completely different model than we're using, than white people are using, and I love it.
yeah.
They're trying to integrate more of African mysticism and African shamanism into their uses and their
That gives me
ceremonies.
chills.
Yeah, it's freaking amazing. I've been a couple times to the Detroit Psychedelic Conference, which is mostly Black and African American people. So it was a total culture shock, and something that I hold very dear and very valuable to my heart, to be like one of only three white people in that room during those conferences. I really got a sense for, what some of them must have felt in certain venues and certain contexts and situations, being outnumbered and things like that. And so they've been very open with me, and I've had a few of them on the podcast, created a lot of different friendships with them. And so yeah, that's definitely something that's being talked about, is and the white people in the psychedelic spaces are definitely aware of white supremacy and white power and exceptionalism and privilege and all these things. I think the psychedelics teach us a lot of those things about ourselves and about our culture in that way, and so we're very grateful for the medicines themselves for pointing those things out in all of us. So let's broaden it out a little bit. So you were talking about drug policy and drug policy reform in general for all drugs, and we're starting to see some of these things. In Oregon, not legalizing, but decriminalizing all drugs, legalizing psilocybin psychotherapy. Washington D.C. decriminalizing all plant medicines. Other places too. I think like 14 or a number around that states in this election made headway with cannabis. And going back just very briefly, California is trying to push for cannabis social clubs, which are
Mhm.
also similar to safe use sites where you can, go into these places and use your cannabis in a way where you don't feel like, the police are watching you or other people are judging you or things like that. And you can socialize and build community with others who like to engage in this. And so as far as like drug policy reform in general goes, I think I'm in the same boat as you. I'd like to see in my lifetime where all drugs are legalized, not just decriminalized, but legalized, because people are going to use no matter what. And, I shared my recent drug policy paper with you that focused mostly on the idea of personal freedom and sovereignty over our own bodies and our own consciousness, right? And with prohibition, I think that is the thing that is being restricted for most of us, is like our own sovereignty over what we put into our bodies and how we want to experience our minds, and our spirituality in a lot of cases is being restricted and stripped away. And we're being told that no, that is not a valid way to go about exploring yourself. You are not allowed to engage in your spirituality if your sacrament is a mushroom, or if your sacrament is some chemical that alters your consciousness and lets you actually connect with the source. We're going to restrict you from that so that you have to get your connection to the source through our approved channels. You have to go see a priest. You have to go see someone else who's in control of these power structures to get your connection. You're not allowed to do it yourself. And that just seems so restrictive to me in a country that was built off of the ideals of personal freedom. And that's what we were trying to break away from. We're trying to break away from oppressive power structures that were trying to tell us how we could access our own spirit. And now we're seeing that again. We know that prohibition of alcohol back in the day didn't work. Alcoholism increased. People still drank. Overdose from alcohol increased because people had to hide it, and they wanted to go on binges instead of being able to use in moderate amounts, right? So we see all sorts of negative things that come from prohibition, but we're still pushing that narrative. And I think one of the biggest hurdles that we have to overcome, and one of the major reasons why we're still in this place that we're in our country, is because of a lack of education. And I think that that's going to be one of the major drivers of a new non-prohibitive state of the union. Is we need to re-educate everyone about drugs. The dare model was so damaging to, this is your brain on drugs with the frying egg. That's so damaging to what the science actually shows us about some of these substances that can have the potential to heal so many people. I mean, heroin in and of itself is not a bad thing. Heroin is given out in hospitals across the world to help people with chronic pain, to help people with terminal illness, to help people die more peacefully. It can be a healing drug. And yes, it gets a bad rap because of its street use. Same thing with psychedelics. It can be used in healing ways to help people transition into death experiences, or to heal their internal family systems and do all this stuff. And it can also be abused, when people have to go underground, and it can lead to negative things when it's laced with fentanyl, because people are getting their drugs off the street that are untested and unregulated. So I think there can be a lot of good things that come from legalization, as far as like lowering overdose, you know, im- improving our well-being. But we need to re-educate people on what drugs really are, and that they've been with us for our entire human history, and that prohibition is only a new thing, and that it's only causing more damage.
Yeah, I think if you look at the time and the effort and the money that was poured into those propaganda, like massive campaigns around drugs, we have never come back with anything else from that. There's never been, oh, here's actually some counter messaging now. And I think you're exactly right. Like if we don't, kind of change, we just have to push out that education. I don't know how to do that because I think it's so ingrained in everything that we do and reinforced by everything that we do. It's a tough one, but I like what you're saying. I mean, the argument you made in your paper that I read was really fascinating to me because I think it appealed to an audience that I generally don't appeal to. I think that this idea of like our religious freedom and these like traditional American values, I never think of that. I'm always thinking like we need to help the people who are hurting the most. And that doesn't fit in line with everyone else's worldview. So I really appreciate this idea that like drug policy reform can be argued for with multiple viewpoints. It just doesn't have to be some like radical person from the left like me, like somebody who's just so, in this one side, it can be bigger than that. And to circle it back to kind of all the stuff we've been talking about, I love the idea of drug use is an issue of our personal autonomy and can also be a way to heal and create community. I think that those two things can be true at the same time. And I almost wonder if like, drug legalization and destigmatization can be a way to kind of build up that empathy and community that we've been losing so much with our individuality. So, yeah. And I'll say too, I will strongly say this, every opioid overdose death in the United States is a policy failure. Every single one. We have the skills, we have the knowledge, we have the tools to prevent every single one of those deaths. So I just get so heated when, there are people who are in like police departments who are saying, I don't remember what state it was, that maybe it was Ohio, I don't know, that said like the 3-strike rule. If you get Narcan or they reverse an overdose for you 3 times, they're not going to respond to the next time you call.
That's a total lack of empathy.
Yeah. And it's like, these are the people, this is law enforcement who are sometimes the first responders on those scenes. So, and law enforcement was the one, and, that's why I love law enforcement against prohibition, the, LEAP organization, because, you hear from the people who had to come to this realization after being indoctrinated with all of these ideas of law enforcement and drugs and like it's tough on crime to crack down on drugs. I just see it as like, the more that we can educate those people who have the power to respond in those situations and to have the power to take away someone's freedom over drugs, that should be our first audience. But it's hard when you have such a toxically masculine field. And I'm going to say that. Yeah, I'm going to say that policing and law enforcement as a whole is toxically masculine. And I think that telling that field to go back on what they have said before is going to be met with a lot of disagreement. And so I don't know how to overcome that. And that's kind of where I'm at, is how do we get those people who have the power to over someone's freedom, essentially, how do we get them on board to see drugs in a new way?
Yeah. So another thing that we're doing with the Denver panel is we're collaborating with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, one of the world's largest nonprofit psychedelic research and harm reduction conglomerates. They're fantastic. And we are in the process right now of creating a curriculum that we are going to provide as training for first responders in Denver. So we're going to be providing it to police, to sheriff in the jails, to EMTs, to firefighters, and to the crisis co-responders, that they're mental health workers that ride along with police and respond to mental health issues. So right now we are creating that curriculum with MAPS and trying to get it out there, hopefully beginning or middle of 2021 in our pilot program. And we're going to use Denver as a model to hopefully go national with the program so that we can start changing those narratives and start teaching them the realities of some of these psychedelic drugs, so we can change that narrative and hopefully give these first responders more tools to be able to deal with people that they come into contact with, so that they're not creating more trauma for that individual, by enforcing law and order type punishments and locking them in cages while in altered states, that can be extremely damaging. I want to get into this policing piece a bit, because I know that this is something that you're passionate about in the drug policy area, and um, it's an area that I've given some thought to, but I want to engage you a little bit more on this policing bit. And the first part I wanted to talk to you about, because you brought it up, was toxic masculinity within the police system. And I have mixed feelings about that term, toxic masculinity. Part of it is because I'm a man, and because um, I view my own masculinity as something that I treasure. I treasure, um, I treasure, pieces of myself that are brought out because I'm a man. The certain energies that I bring to certain situations, certain, feelings of strength. People come to me in psychedelic spaces and they tell me, like, thank you for being my rock, for being my mountain, for being that strength for me when I couldn't find my grounding. And that comes from my masculinity. It comes from, um, my sense of who I am. And so I think this is something that needs to be discussed more openly among all sorts of people. The differences between masculinity, which I don't think is bad. I think there's masculinity and there's femininity, and it's possible for each person to have aspects of both. I think for me, I've been working on a lot of my bringing out parts of my inner feminine pieces so that I can be more holistic. You got to have the yin and the yang. You got to have both energies in balance within your personhood to feel whole. And it has felt really empowering to engage, my vulnerabilities and my nurturing side and all these other things. But that being said, like, I deeply value my masculine energy, and I don't want to be forced to have to give it up because others don't know the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity. So, can we talk a little bit about that first? And because I don't think it would be productive for our whole society to switch from um, to switch all males into a feminine role. I think if the entire society went feminine, then there would be toxic femininity, and I'm sure that's out there too. I think there needs to be a balance between healthy femininity and healthy masculinity. And so how do you view the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity? Like, what's
Yeah.
the difference there?
Sure. So I think masculinity is super important. I think for me, I have a lot of masculine energy in certain ways too, which has, led to positives and negatives in life. But I think to bring this back to this idea of internal family systems, the way I think of toxic masculinity, to bring it back to your analogy of the log cabin, I think there are aspects of our society that create an environment that encourages men, or anyone who identifies as a man, anyone who embodies that masculine energy, to put out anything that's not that, to isolate those things in the cold, any of the feminine energy, those more like caring, compassionate, like emotional pieces, to put those out into the cold. So when I say toxic masculinity, I do think it's toxic for society, but I think it's not an individual fault. It's not because a man is showing too much masculinity. It's because we've created an environment that encourages men to push that and isolate those pieces of themselves that are more feminine. And I'm actually reading a paper right now. It's called Who's the Man? Masculinity Studies, Terry Stops, and Police Training. And so they're talking about how like toxic masculinity can come out in the police force, and how that can lead to some of the like police brutality that we're seeing. And the thing that led me to say this first was that I have a friend who actually two things. One, I have a friend who is dating or is in a relationship with a police officer right now in Colorado. And he was talking about how when you join the police academy, you have to answer a question. Like it's like I don't know if it's a survey or what. I haven't done it, so I couldn't tell you. And on the survey, it says, why do you want to become a police officer? and the majority of people will write because they want to help people. And his idea was, you know, perhaps men are going into the field of policing more because it's a socially acceptable way for a man to enter a helping profession. So when you look at social work, when you look at, you know, counseling, like it is like there's more women in these fields than there are men. And so I think there's something to be said for this idea that there are acceptable ways for men to be in a helping profession, and less acceptable or less normal ways in our society. And that, as soon as she told me that story, I was like, wow, like, because I have been very, you know, we need to abolish the police, we need to get rid of the police. And this gave me this perspective of like, okay, well, people are trying to help people, and so maybe it's there's something about the law enforcement system, the hierarchy, the, you know, I've read a lot of articles that refer to it as like a boys club, and this like toxic environment, that's what I think is leading to all of this harm caused by the police. And I think that we could do something about it. I don't know what that is yet, but I think that we could change it.
But do you think it's the, you know, the I guess patriarchal nature of it, the like you said, the hierarchical or power aspects of it that makes it toxic? Because, you know, I hear stories of what police were, you know, back in the 20s and 30s, and they were community officers. They were people um, that the community saw as part of their in group. You know, they'd walk around the streets and they'd help, and they'd play with little kids, and, you know, they would do friendly tasks for the neighborhood people. And nowadays police are more focused on like law and order and cracking down on infringements on law, or people breaking the law. And you know, it seems like their internal focus has changed from helping the community to punishing the community in general. And I don't know if that's probably like a systems philosophy that has changed, but that's what I see. And I know there's a lot of great police officers out there who are genuinely in it to help their communities, but I think that the higher ups above them are more like they in their meetings, like I'm sure they talk less about like how are we going to go out and help our community today, and more about like, okay, how are we going to crack down on these problems today? You know, like their focus is, I think it comes, you know, from top down, and it's more focused on fixing the problems as opposed to helping bolster community.
Mm-hmm. I think when you bring up this idea of policing back in the day,
Mhm.
I'm tempted to ask the question, you know, whose community whose children were police officers playing with? Who were they helping? Because
Sure.
I've been listening to a lot of podcasts recently about the origins of policing, and how the true origin of policing was for like the rich. It was for the rich. It was to, yeah, to protect their property, to protect property is really what it was all about. So I have trouble. I'm like, okay, I can see that people, you know, we're all human. So people who even had the job of protecting property, whether that be enslaved people, whether that be physical property, you know, I'm sure those people still did serve the community of the white people very well. I'm sure they were super friendly. I'm sure that they were really nice. And I would be curious. I wish I could go into a time machine and just see what the difference would be. And if, because, you know, it's not the police officer working in a vacuum. We've said this before. Like, it's nothing is in a vacuum. It's all about the rest of it too. But I always think back to the origin of policing as a method of controlling on behalf of the rich. And it's hard for me to get past that, because even till now, I have not seen evidence. Like, we know that law enforcement is not clearing violent crime as well as as well as they're doing, you know, arresting people for drug use, for example, something like that. We know that violent crime isn't being solved at the rate that it could be. We know that, you know, police brutality. We know that unarmed Black people are getting killed by the police at immense rates. And I think, like, it's for us to even be sitting here and having a conversation about it, to me, the level is so alarming that, like, this should be the top conversation going on everywhere right now. I'm just like, to me, an institution is actively killing people who are unarmed, like that's not, I don't think that should just be a discussion that two interested people are having on a podcast. I think that everyone should be like stopping and like changing this right now. And I guess that's a part of my sense of urgency, which is a part of white supremacy culture, by the way.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know. I think as a woman too, my perspective on police, for full disclosure, I've had two people in my life, in my direct life, who have been sexually assaulted by on duty police officers.
Mm.
I look at the domestic abuse, domestic violence rates among police officers. So these are the things that I'm seeing. And my self deception, this bias to choose things that back up my own belief, I'm definitely doing that. But I mean, when I used to do Narcan trainings and overdose response trainings, we would train police officers.
Mhm.
And I, the feeling in the room of being this younger woman training these like big uniform guys in there with guns that are just visible to you, and I'm trying to train them on how to respond to overdose. I was just met with like, condescension and honestly some blatant disrespect in that moment. And that experience has been confirmed by multiple other women that I've spoken to. I spoke to, or I watched a presentation by somebody, a social worker, who is part of one of those teams where, they're trying to pair social workers with police to
Mhm.
respond to calls. And she was saying that she would be in ride-alongs and they would be saying really like sexist things about people in general, about their like frequent flyers, saying really dehumanizing things. And her supervisor just said, "Oh, that's just how it is. Like that's just how police are. They're going to say sexist things to you." And she said that if you're not getting the respect you want, you should try baking them some cookies. And when I heard that, I'm just like, something has to change here, because if we're not listening to women, if we're not, trying these new approaches because a woman is the one telling you, like it did have a very boys club feeling. It was really intimidating. And I think that's what I think of when I think of doing these psychedelic trainings that you're talking about. I'm wondering who's doing that training and how are you going to ensure that it's somebody who will be listened to, as opposed to someone like me who was a young woman going into this big room of police officers. So that's just something I would encourage you to consider as you
Oh
go to
yeah.
plan that.
And we're considering that already, and I've
Yeah.
been selected as one of those people who will give the trainings because specifically because I look like them. I am a large, muscular white male with tattoos all the way down my arms, and they're way more likely to listen to me than someone else. So we're definitely giving that thought. And specifically for the police and less so, I mean, still for fire departments and stuff, but less so for like co-responders and EMTs and things like that. But as you talk about it and describe it for the police, the toxic aspects of the system, I can't help but think about the military too as being one of these places where there are toxicity in general. I don't know if it's necessarily toxic masculinity, although war is typically associated with males and masculinity. Um, so I can't help but think of our military culture too, and how little is spoken about, you know, supporting our military blindly to go overseas and sure go after people who are a threat to other people and to our country, but a lot of innocents get gunned down too in those firefights, and very little is spoken about it. Very little uproar about the innocent lives that are lost, like you mentioned, police taking innocent lives and things like that too, or unarmed lives. And I I have to disagree with you on one point about the abolition of police. Um, I think that I mean it's a great idea. I would love it if the world was so peaceful that we wouldn't have a need for some sort of community protector. If everybody had their own, you know, I'm all about self-sufficiency and self-reliance and self-survival. So I've taken it upon myself to get myself trained. You know, I'm trained in hand-to-hand combat. I'm trained in firearms. I'm trained in, um, you know, strategy and de-escalation and all these things, so that if someone were breaking down my door to harm my family or to steal my food resources or something, like I have the wherewithal to be able to protect myself without the need for police. But there's so many people out there that have not taken it upon themselves to get that sort of training, and that if all police went away, um, I could see, you know, people taking advantage of others and people harming others, people being harmed who don't have the ability to protect themselves or don't have the desire. They don't want to take that responsibility to protect themselves. And so I wonder about those types of people too. And, you know, it's a great idea to not have to need police. Um, but at the same time, I think there is still a need for those who choose not to or have the inability to protect themselves.
And I think I should have clarified, like when I say police abolition, I consider myself, and this is not my term, I don't remember who coined this term, but I consider myself a baby abolitionist, meaning I think the idea is great. I think it's imaginative. I think that it represents a new opportunity that's completely different from what we have now. And I recognize that we don't have, like I have been talking about, we don't have the empathy, we don't have this collective community compassion that we would need
Mhm.
as a foundation from which to build a world with abolition. And I want to pair that, like I know it's far off and it's scary to think about a world without police. But I wonder, I mean, there's this article I've been reading about by Derica Purnell. She's a human rights lawyer who's also an abolitionist. And she writes, police abolition initially repulsed me. The idea seemed white and utopic. I'd seen too much sexual violence and buried too many friends to consider getting rid of police in St. Louis, let alone the nation. But in reality, the police were a placebo. Calling them felt like something. As legal scholar Michelle Alexander explains, something feels like everything when your other option is nothing. And
Mhm.
I think of this idea of police being sort of a placebo when I think about who who are they protecting and when. I
Mhm.
mean, I listen to a lot of true crime. It's like my guilty pleasure is true crime podcasts, but um, the police have performed poorly when trying to solve homicides.
Mhm.
When somebody gets raped, the police are often the ones who are victim blaming. They usually never are able to do much in terms of protecting people from rapists,
Mhm.
even kidnappings. Like, we're just not solving, there's not the evidence to show me that our police are solving things that would make them so inherently necessary on that functioning level. I think for the psychological level of our society, we do need something like that. I watched Adam Ruins Everything. I don't know if
Mhm. I
you
love
see,
that
yeah.
show.
Yeah, he did the one about the TSA like at the airport and how like it doesn't actually do very much for us, but it makes us feel safer. So I wonder if in a world of abolition, what can we do to create an environment where people do feel safer that doesn't require an institution that is actively harming its own citizens?
Mhm. Yeah, and I want to propose an idea, and this is probably going to be taken as a bit radical by many listeners out there who, you know, are very peacefully minded. But you know, I love Switzerland's model, where every household is required to have a firearm in the household.
I was
And
born there, by the way. Did you know that?
yeah, I just learned
Okay,
that.
cool.
That's awesome. Do you still have citizenship there?
No, I actually never had citizenship there
Okay.
because they make it so hard.
Yeah.
You have to have both parents with citizenship, and my
Yeah.
parents didn't. So,
That's part of the reason why I'm actually pursuing a PhD, is because in order to get citizenship in Switzerland, which is where I hope to retire, like they are hundreds of times more likely to grant you citizenship if they find that you're going to bring value to their country. And a lot more people with doctorate degrees get let in than than people that don't. So
Yeah.
Switzerland is a place that I would love to live.
Oh, yes.
They have this policy where each household has to have a firearm in the household, and they're a very peaceful society. You know, people aren't going out shooting each other. Switzerland is one of the few countries in the world that has never been overtaken or overrun by military force. Back in Hitler's day, when he was moving across, Europe, he tried, but it didn't work. And then he just decided, oh, I'm going to skip Switzerland because they're too well armed, right?
Yeah.
So that's one solution I think that could be helpful, is that, here in America where guns are still allowed, we should uh, we should provide the arming of our society, but also couple that with proper training and proper education around firearms, right? You can't just go out and hand out guns to people. But like for me, like I learned from the age of 4 about firearms. My mom taught me about firearms and I grew up with them. And so I know what they're capable of, and I have a deep respect for the power that they hold, and that the person who holds them holds, right? And so there is no chance in my life that I would ever want to use a firearm on any other person unless absolutely necessary, right? And that comes with that deep respect and that education and that training. So I think providing a means to defend yourself to every single American, as well as the education around it and philosophy around it as well, and the ethics around it as well, could be beneficial. I also think that guns don't solve everything, and some things could be handled on a much less violent way. So, in my master's program, which was in sport and performance psychology, we were in this sport psychology in society class, and one of our projects was to come up with a social program related to sport that we think could help benefit society. And my program was to institute mandatory jujitsu participation in schools. So in middle school and high school, everyone would have to participate in jujitsu instruction, which for those of you who don't know what jujitsu is, it's a non-striking martial art. So there's no punching or kicking. It's often called the gentle art because its main focus is on how to be able to control your body in a way that you're able to control somebody else's body so as not to do harm, right? So most jujitsu techniques, to some extent, will cause you to take control over someone's body, their limbs and their torso, so that they can't harm themselves and so they can't harm anybody else until you can talk them down, talk them out of it, right? Now, you can take the techniques to their full extent and you know, um, hyperextend people's limbs and tear tendons and choke people
Oh,
unconscious and things like that, which is also useful in certain situations, right?
yeah.
And we're seeing that too with police. Like they don't have enough training in some of these things, and that's why they'll apply chokeholds for way too long and kill people with them. Whereas if everyone from a young age was trained in the full capability of their body and understood what what can happen in a physical altercation, I get a sense that most people would not want to get in a physical altercation just because they know what could happen. And a lot of studies have shown that people with martial arts training are less violent, are more open, more caring, more loving, and are less likely to be bullies in everyday life because they know what can happen when things get physical. And it's usually the people with no training who go out and seek violence, who seek that kind of thing. And so my proposal is that everyone get jujitsu training in middle school and high school, and then everyone has the ability to defend themselves with a firearm and has the proper education and knowledge and ethics to go along with that. And I take my I'm not just throwing these out there, but I take it off of evidence from Switzerland for the firearms. And then interestingly enough, I think it's the United Arab Emirates. There's a prince over there who has made jujitsu their national sport. And
Oh,
so
cool.
it's in every single high school. It's in every single middle school right now, and it's a required class that people take. And they have, so their entire population over there is well versed in physical hand-to-hand combat, and there's very low instances of physical violence because of it, and they've turned it into a sporting aspect. So they have legal venues, much like safe use sites, where you can go sign up for a tournament and get to practice and test yourself with your physical abilities. And then people have no reason to go take it out on the streets. So I think if everyone had the ability to defend themselves, we would have much less of a need for reliance on some external entity like the police to be able to do that for us.
Yeah. And what you're saying is abolitionist thinking.
Sure.
I think that when people think of abolition, they think of like, because when I first heard the word, I was sick picturing like, bright green grass and blue skies and rainbows and butterflies are flying all around and there's never any conflict. And of course that's unreasonable to think about. And I know that, I do separate myself from a lot of people on the left or, however people categorize me by saying I do agree with you. I think that the same way I don't believe in drug prohibition, why would gun prohibition? Why would that be different? Why would that work? Same thing you're saying. If you grow up with it, we've seen the same thing. My dad was born and raised in Italy, and uh, he started drinking wine at like 4 years old. Never had like an issue with alcohol in his life because he was just like, it was never anything dramatic. And he said teenagers in Italy, they don't get blacked out like we do here because they've had access to it. So I'm all for it. I think we need to get into these schools. We need to teach people martial arts, yes, equip people with firearms later on. Also, maybe throw in some emotion regulation
Yeah,
training, maybe a little
totally.
DBT, maybe a little IFS. School, that's where it's at. And I think we can come to a point of agreement on that. Like I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Back in the day, they had shooting programs as part of physical education classes in schools. I went to a military high school for a number of years, and we had a shooting team. I was the captain of our shooting team, so
Wow.
we'd go to West Point, and we'd go to the Naval Academy, and we'd compete against their shooting teams, and other colleges that had shooting teams. And so if it's taught in that way through proper education, I think we can get rid of a lot of this fear and a lot of this this need for other people to protect us.
Hmm. With both of these things, with firearms, same thing with drugs. Imagine if instead of bringing the stigma and the fear and the moral judgment, we were to hold these items with reverence.
Yeah,
Like, I just think that would be so transformative.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and to wrap it up and get back to what we originally were talking about with the self, I think that for everybody out there, being able to hold the self in reverence, not our identity, not our ego, not holding those in reverence necessarily. I mean, those are important, and they're important things to accept and to cherish and to love. But that deeper sense of ourself, right? That thing that we're all connected to, and we all feel it. We all feel it, and it's all part of our life. But if we can somehow devote a little bit more energy to exploring that piece and holding that piece in reverence, our own divinity, and the divinity that is inherent in every single other human being and every single other form of life, whether it be plant or animal or insect or whatever. If we can hold reverence for that innate thing that ties us all together, I think it can be that thing that unites us all.
Yes, I
Yeah.
totally agree.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. It's been super fun.
Heck yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, time just flew by. We
Yeah.
did 2 hours real quick and covered a lot of cool topics. So, yeah, I really appreciate you being on. Hope to have continuing talks with you through our mutual work through the Social Work Research Center at
Mhm.
CSU. And for all you listeners out there, do your best to connect with that aspect of self. If there's anything of interest that you found in this podcast, we encourage you to go look it up online and go down your own rabbit holes with them, because Milena and I are certainly not experts, and we put that out there, many times, hopefully during the podcast, that we are not the end all be all to any of these topics. We're just spouting our own opinions and hoping to move the conversation forward. So go have your own conversations out there, and let's move our collective self and our collective energies towards a more peaceful world for all of us. All right. Thanks, Milena. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.